June 22nd, 1941. Before dawn, the sky above Belarus burns red. German shells scream through the air, slamming into the walls of Brest Fortress. Barracks crumble, radios fall silent, and the world seems to end in thunder. From the ruins, dazed Soviet soldiers claw their way out of the dust, cut off, surrounded, and without orders. Their uniforms are torn, their weapons scattered, but they fight anyway. Wave after wave of Luftwaffe bombers tear the morning apart. Artillery pounds the fortress from every direction. Inside, nurses drag the wounded back through smoke-filled tunnels, while civilians carry ammunition through rivers of fire. Every corner becomes a battlefield, every room a last stand. When the Germans demand surrender, the only answer comes scrawled in blood across the stone walls. "I'm dying, but I won't surrender." For 8 relentless days, the defenders of Brest Fortress held their ground against impossible odds. They had no reinforcements, no communication, only courage, fury, and the will to fight until the very end. What began here was more than a battle. It was the first spark of a war that would engulf the world. But months before that fiery dawn, peace seemed certain. In August 1939, 2 sworn enemies, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, shook hands over a map of Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact promised non-aggression, but its secret lines carved entire nations apart. While the world gasped, Stalin smiled. He thought he had bought time. As Hitler crushed France and stared west toward Britain, Stalin moved east, absorbing the Baltics, Bessarabia, and half of Poland. The Red Army marched through the silence, convinced no danger loomed from Berlin. Soviet propaganda spoke of friendship. Trains loaded with grain and oil rolled west, feeding the German war machine. But beneath the surface, the ground was shifting. Along the western frontier, German divisions were massing. Thousands of tanks, artillery, and troops hidden behind a wall of lies. Soviet intelligence warned of it. Spies, border guards, even foreign diplomats sent desperate reports to Moscow. Stalin ignored them all. He believed Hitler's reassurances more than his own generals. To him, talk of invasion was nothing but a British trick, a trap meant to drag the USSR into another capitalist war. While Stalin dreamed of peace, Hitler was already writing the opening chapter of destruction. While German armies gathered in silence, Stalin's greatest enemy was not outside his borders, but within them. Years earlier, during the Great Purge, paranoia swept through the Soviet ranks like a plague. Generals, strategists, heroes of the revolution, one by one, they vanished. Some were executed at dawn. Others disappeared into the frozen gulags of Siberia. By 1941, 3 out of every 4 officers in the Red Army were new, untested, and afraid. Experience had been replaced by obedience. No one dared to question orders. No one dared to bring bad news to the Kremlin. When reports arrived of German tanks massing near the border, Stalin's commanders hesitated. They had seen what happened to those who alarmed the leader. So they stayed silent. The Red Army that once dreamed of conquering Europe now trembled at its own shadow. Its commanders looked to Moscow for guidance, but Moscow only stared back in suspicion. And as Stalin purged his own protectors, the fortress walls of the Soviet Union were hollowed out from within. By the summer of 1941, the stage was set. The world's largest army stood massive on paper, but fatally broken in spirit. When the Soviet frontier moved west after seizing Poland and the Baltic states, it stretched like a thin, trembling line across Europe. Old fortifications, once formidable, were now hundreds of kilometers behind the new border, abandoned to weeds and rust. The new defenses? Still half-built. Some never even started. Yet Stalin's generals, eager to impress, declared everything was ready. Divisions were packed dangerously close to the frontier, rows of tanks, aircraft, and troops exposed under the open sky. There were no fallback lines, no defense in depth. If the enemy broke through the first line, there would be nothing left to stop them. Airfields sat in plain sight, their bombers parked wing to wing like targets waiting to burn. Barracks were built too close to the border, command posts too easy to find. Every mistake was hidden under layers of false confidence and fear of telling Stalin the truth. To the world, the Soviet Union appeared unbreakable. But behind the illusion stood an army poised not for defense, but for invasion. And when the hammer finally fell, it would fall on the line of soldiers trapped between the enemy ahead and a leader who refused to believe the danger behind. On paper, the Red Army was a giant. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of aircraft, the largest force the world had ever seen. But numbers can lie. The mighty Soviet armor was a patchwork of outdated machines, fragile, underpowered relics from another decade. The proud T-26 and BT series rattled and broke down before they even reached the front. Fuel was scarce, radios were missing, spare parts, almost none. Hidden among this rusting steel were the new T-34s and KV tanks, powerful, revolutionary designs, but too few to turn the tide. They were islands of strength in a sea of weakness. Above them, the Red Air Force claimed supremacy in the skies, yet most of its planes were biplanes from the past, slow, fragile, and hopelessly outmatched by the Luftwaffe's sleek Messerschmitts. Pilots had barely trained in the new MiGs and Yaks. They would learn their machines under fire. And worst of all, the airfields lay wide open near the border, crowded and exposed. When the first bombs fell, hundreds of aircraft burned before they ever left the ground. The illusion of power shattered in a single morning, replaced by smoke, chaos, and disbelief. June 22nd, 1941. The day the sky fell. German artillery thundered across a 2,900-kilometer front. The Luftwaffe roared overhead, bombing airfields, railways, and barracks in a single devastating strike. Within hours, entire divisions of the Red Army were in flames. Command posts went silent. Communication lines were cut. Soldiers fought without orders, unsure who was alive or dead. And at the very top, silence. For half a day, Stalin said nothing. Reports flooded into Moscow. Cities burning, airfields destroyed, tanks overrun. Yet Stalin refused to believe it. He called it a provocation, a mistake by rogue German generals. He ordered his commanders not to return fire, not to fall for tricks. In those frozen hours of indecision, the Soviet front began to collapse. German spearheads ripped through the border defenses, encircling entire armies before they could even mobilize. Officers begged for permission to strike back, and heard only static in reply. The leader who ruled through fear was now paralyzed by his own disbelief. And as the Wehrmacht surged eastward, the fate of millions hung in the deadly quiet of Stalin's hesitation. As the Red Army crumbled, small pockets of defiance began to burn across the front. At Brest Fortress on the western border, Soviet soldiers woke to the sound of explosions and chaos. They were surrounded within hours, cut off, without food, without water, but they refused to surrender. Inside the shattered walls, they fought room by room, tunnel by tunnel. When ammunition ran out, they used their bayonets. When bayonets broke, they fought with their hands. German loudspeakers called for surrender. The only reply was gunfire. On the fortress walls, someone carved a message into the stone. "I'm dying, but I won't surrender. Farewell, motherland." It would be found months later, blackened by fire. Similar acts of defiance echoed at Raseiniai, where a single KV-2 tank held off an entire German division for a full day, its cannon roaring until the last shell was spent. These were not victories, they were last stands, but they lit a spark amid the ashes. In a war of machines and terror, the courage of a few began to remind the world that the Soviet spirit would not die quietly. By July 1941, the Red Army was bleeding from every direction. The Germans moved like lightning, slicing through defenses, surrounding entire armies before they even knew they were lost. In Belarus, the great city of Minsk fell within a week. More than 300,000 Soviet troops were trapped and captured, a catastrophe beyond imagination. To the south, Smolensk burned. Columns of refugees stretched for miles, choking the roads with carts, animals, and the wounded. Everywhere the same nightmare repeated. Encirclement, collapse, capture. The Wehrmacht advanced so fast that maps couldn't keep up. Towns reported liberated by the Soviets one day were in German hands the next. The Red Army, desperate and disoriented, destroyed its own bridges, trains, and factories in retreat, leaving behind only ashes for the invaders. Those who couldn't escape were ordered to fight to the last bullet. Those who did escape were often shot by their own officers for retreating without permission. By late summer, over 2 million Soviet soldiers were gone, dead, captured, or missing. The once mighty Red Army had been shattered. And still, the Germans showed no sign of stopping. As summer faded into autumn, the war turned into something darker. In the north, German forces reached the gates of Leningrad, the cradle of the revolution. Hitler gave a single order: no surrender, no supplies, let them starve. And so began one of the longest sieges in human history. For 900 days, the city was cut off. No food, no heat, no hope. People boiled wallpaper for glue, ate pets, leather, even sawdust bread. In the silence of frozen streets, corpses lay buried beneath the snow. But the red banner still flew. To the south, another disaster unfolded at Kiev. Stalin refused to withdraw his armies, insisting the city must be held at any cost. The result was one of the largest encirclements in military history. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers trapped and destroyed. Entire fronts vanished. Generals were executed for failure. And still, the German advance pressed onward, toward the heart of the Soviet Union, toward Moscow itself. As cities burned and millions died, one question echoed across the vast steppes. Could the Red Army rise again, before the motherland ceased to exist? By October 1941, the German war machine had reached the edge of Moscow. The capital trembled. Factories shut down, archives burned, and the government prepared to flee. But Stalin stayed. His words were simple: not one step back. The Red Army, battered and broken, dug trenches in the frozen soil. Civilians, students, workers, even children joined them, turning the outskirts of Moscow into a fortress of desperation. As the first snow fell, the Germans launched their final push, tanks grinding forward through ice and blood. Then came the cold. The temperature dropped below -30, engines froze, soldiers starved. The once invincible Wehrmacht, built for speed and conquest, was now trapped in a white grave. And in that moment, the Red Army struck back. Fresh Siberian divisions, hardened by winter, stormed through the snow with rifles blazing. For the first time, the Germans retreated. The myth of their invincibility was shattered before the gates of Moscow. It was not victory, not yet, but survival. And from the frozen ruins of 1941, a new Soviet spirit was born, one that would carry them all the way to Berlin. As the fires of war faded and the smoke cleared, the Soviet Union stood battered but unbroken. From the ashes of cities and the silence of mass graves, a new strength was forged. The siege of Leningrad, the frozen fields of Moscow, and the countless unnamed battles became scars and symbols. Millions had fallen, yet their sacrifice ignited a resolve that no enemy could extinguish. The Soviet people had faced hell itself and endured. In the end, it was not victory alone that defined them, but survival, and the unyielding spirit of a nation reborn through fire.